Welcome to another show. I go by the name Doug Banks with more skills than Tom Hanks. Football is around the corner, a couple weeks away. Can you believe it? Another year of Nebraska football is coming. I'm kind of excited. I know a lot of fans are excited as we normally are around this time of year. Just the anticipation, a year has gone by and people are ready to fill fill the seats of Memorial Stadium once again. Entering into a new era with a new regime in the likes of Matt Rule and the coaching staff. And the team will be quite relatively new as well. A lot of the guys that were there last year aren't there this year. Some of them went to the NFL. Others have transferred. Others have quit and said, hey, I'm done playing football. So this is going to be a much different looking Husker team, although there are still a lot of holdovers from the previous regime. But a team that's going to be different nonetheless. And once again, another with a different scheme on both ends. Offensively, Nebraska's going back to more power, ground and pound, play action and the use of the tight ends and the fullback. And, that sounds good for, a lot of, old school fans like myself that have always loved that brand of football. On the defense, they're going to a 3-3-5, and which is a unique defense and should be relatively good. The 3-3-5 should be good against teams that like to spread you out and throw the football, which the Big Ten is kind of going in that direction. And with the addition of teams like USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon, I think the 3-3-5 is might end up working in Nebraska's favor in the long term, because those teams like to spread you out and throw the football. And as we saw in the college football playoff, Michigan playing TCU, the 3-3-5 can also be good against the run. Now, we know they got destroyed by TCU went on to get destroyed by Georgia, but that's Georgia. No one was beating that team. Georgia had an elite defense. They had speed all over the offensively. They had speed everywhere. They had a lot of weapons. They were able to run the football. I mean, they're big up front. It didn't matter who was playing in that championship. Georgia was gonna win and win big. So maybe not 65 points big, but they still would have won no matter who played. But that's what's happening going forward. And obviously, you don't put much stock into year one. We'll see how Nebraska looks with the likes of Jeff Sims, Anthony Grant, Gabe Ervin in the backfield, Billy Kemp, who's supposed to be one of the top wide receivers for the Huskers. We'll see how he looks. Could possibly be a Wendell Robinson type, as he is a small wide receiver, but seems to be someone who could be very versatile. You could put him in different places and get him the football, much like a Wells Welker or in Mendola. Those guys who obviously play for the New England Patriots. A Julian Edelman looks like he's that type of player. We should expect a heavier use of the tight ends. Guys like Thomas Fidone to be showcased more within his offense. And a fullback. They're bringing the fullback back. So, hopefully my cousin, John Goodwin, can get some snaps back there. as he did play halfback in high school. And he's not the most athletic, the most quickest, or fastest, rather. But he is someone that can. He is very skilled. He is fundamentally sound. He does all the right things, and he is someone that can help a team. So we'll see if he gets some playing time under Coach Rule and this new regime going into 2023. But that's not what I came here to talk about. Before we go forward, I'd like to go back to October 9th, 2021. And this is something that I've been pondering, that I've been thinking about. What if Nebraska won this game? This was the game that almost was for Scott Frost. They win this game, who knows what would have happened for that team. As Nebraska was in a lot of games that season and had a chance to win a lot of those games that season. A lot of those games were one-score losses. Coming into this particular game, Nebraska was 500. Coming off of some tough losses to Oklahoma on the road and Michigan State, which they basically held scoreless the entire second half, only to lose in overtime because special teams couldn't stop the return man from scoring. And that's literally how Nebraska lost. But it wasn't just that. Nebraska still had a chance to win, but how they managed things within the final few minutes of that overtime also cost them. So Nebraska was in dire need of this type of game, this type of win, where the season was kind of weighing in the balance. It could either go one way or the other. Nebraska was 500, 3-3, coming off of a blowout over Northwestern at home. Michigan, on the flip side, there were a lot of questions surrounding the program. Will Jim Harbaugh stay? Will he go to the NFL? A lot of the fan base was starting to lose confidence in Harbaugh, as he would tend to lose to this other team that has silver helmets and stars on their helmet and wore red, and their stadium is exactly like ours. So this game was brewing. The anticipation for this game was brewing, and was expected to be one of the biggest games of the night. And it certainly was. Michigan coming in 6-0. Trying to show that they're more than just a decent team in the regular season. Trying to take that next step to get into college football playoff status and compete, and not just compete, but see if they can bring home a national championship. Get the monkey off the back by beating the team down south, or the team in the east. That's where Michigan was at the time. Let's go over the stars for both sides. For Nebraska, Obviously, Adrian Martinez was the biggest star. And probably the only star, quite frankly, on Nebraska's offense. I mean, Nebraska had some good players, don't get me wrong. They had some decent talent. But Adrian Martinez, we all know, was the main guy that made everything go. Without Adrian Martinez, I think Nebraska would have struggled even more so to try to win football games. Because Adrian Martinez, with his dual threat capabilities, his ability to scramble and keep plays alive, especially with the offensive line that was relatively inconsistent. It wasn't great that year. Nebraska at times struggled to run the football that year. Nebraska at times struggled to protect and defend their quarterback that year. But at the very least, it was better than the 2022 version, right? So Adrian Martinez was the main star. On the defensive side for Nebraska, this was Coach Shenender's best defense that he had coaching. Had a lot of super seniors, a lot of holdovers due to you know what in 2020. So you had the likes of a Cam Taylor-Britt, Ty Robinson, JoJo Doman, DiCaprio Bootle, Markel Desmuke. Those were and of course Garrett Nelson. And I believe for a while Will Honus was a part of that defense too, but I believe he got hurt. I believe he had got hurt before the season started. Otherwise, I would put Will Honus in there as well. But those were the main stars for the defensive side for Nebraska. And I only threw Ty Robinson in there because he's one of the better guys in the trenches, but he wasn't. I wouldn't say he's elite. I'd say he's a very good lineman. Now let's flip it to Michigan. At quarterback, they had Cade McNamara. And Cade, quite honestly, was a saving grace for Jim Harbaugh because they were struggling to kind of find some consistency at that position. Cade came in and really stabilized things for Jim Harbaugh. Really straightened things out. They had dynamic play at the wide receiver position. Let me say that again. They had dynamic play at the wide receiver position. One, because I had to get my words together, but two, it needed to be repeated because, quite honestly, that was one of the differences of this game. Cornelius Johnson was one of those wide receivers that made plays in this game. His name is important because he would be the reason that Michigan beats Ohio State on the road this past year. He had a lot of big plays in that game. At the running back position, they had some playmakers. Hassan Haskins, which was one of the better running backs in the Big Ten. And then, of course, eventual Heisman nominee, light-skinned dude. His name will come to me. Maybe it won't come to me. I have to look it up. Give me a sec. Blake Corum. So Hassan Haskins and Blake Corum. And those two were two of the best running backs in the Big Ten. And Blake Corum obviously was up for, potential Heisman discussions. Blake Corum's dynamic, speedy, very shifty. You get him in space, it's goodbye. He's that explosive. On the defensive end, especially in the trenches, and this was another difference maker, you had Ojibo. And he was the guy that ended up making the strip on AJ Martinez to eventually put Michigan up by 3 points in this game. So as you can see, I'm setting the stage up and I'm prefacing a lot of what I'm talking about. You should hear throughout the course of my conversation about this game as common factors that kept Nebraska from really breaking through and getting to the other side of things as a program. To me, this was Scott Frost's best game that he called as a Husker head coach. You saw a little bit of everything. You saw some misdirections. You saw Adrian looking good, looking healthy, getting Michigan with his dual threat ability. We saw the use of. We saw Ramir Johnson being used in the best manner that Frost ever used him. We still struggled at times to get the run game going, but Frost was very creative with the offense, and they really the offense did a lot of great things in this game. It was the best that the offense ever looked under Scott Frost. And the defense stepped up, made plays, got some. I think they got one turnover. They got one turnover, but it was a big turnover when you needed it. I remember going back watching the game, and it just felt like a game that Nebraska was going to win. That's the feeling I was getting. Even going back and watching it now, I felt that way. I'm like, man, I feel like it was set up for Nebraska to win. But there were a lot of things that I noticed that kept Nebraska from going to the next level. And a lot of those things I actually pointed out as I was setting the stage up for this conversation. Let's start with number one, the trenches. Nebraska's O-line, very inconsistent that year. At moments they were good. Other moments they weren't. They were sometimey. Nebraska struggled to consistently run the football against teams. This game was no different. They were thin at running back, so they had to lean on Ramir Johnson more. Although there were a couple other backs that they could have used, but Scott Frost elected not to do that. He just stayed primarily using Ramir Johnson. Because if you remember, in the Oklahoma matchup, Gabe Ervin had got hurt. So that was a big loss. And I believe we had Dietrich Mills, but we didn't use him till like towards the end of the season because he just wasn't healthy. So that's basically what you had going on. But if I remember correctly, we also had a guy in the likeness of a Marvin Scott. Came out of Florida, a short but very stocky, strong back. Had a strong freshman campaign, and Frost elected not to play him at all. And see, this was another issue. That was another issue. Frost's unwillingness to give other players a chance to see what they can do on the field. Put them on the field, see what they can do. I believe Frost at times was I'll put it like this. Frost at times didn't reflect his mantra. No fear of failure. It's like he was so afraid a guy would make a mistake, he wouldn't put him on the field. Or you make a couple mistakes, you're off the field, and then you don't really see him again. How Marvin Scott, who was one of the more productive backs for you in 2020, was a great blocker, did everything you asked him to do, yet for some reason you don't see him at all in 2021. That was one issue. That was a big issue, and a big reason why Nebraska never got to the other side. I believe had he done this, Wandell probably would have still been there. And Wandell probably would have been the difference maker in a lot of those games. As you know, I'm talking about Wandell Robinson. Had a big 2020 campaign, 2019-2020 campaign with Nebraska. And then went on to Kentucky and became one of their best wide receivers and had a big year that year and is now with the New York Giants. But again, I got sidetracked, but I need to point that out also because that was a big thing that kept Nebraska from going to the other side. The trenches was the primary thing. I went back and looked at their recruiting. A lot of the guys that they brought in are no longer there at Nebraska. A lot of them have either transferred. A lot of them have transferred out, and or they just didn't develop. Get there, don't really develop, so they don't really see any playing time. They stay on a scout team. Another thing is, I think that offensive line, there is some talent on that O-line, but I think it was given too much to think about. So it was like, okay, I need to be here, and you need to be there in order for this type of scheme to work. I just think Frost gave too much for the players to think about, and I think that impacted the performance of the offensive line. They didn't just go out there and play, you know, and just go with the flow of the game. You saw a lot of overthinking that resulted to a lot of guys being out of position. Other teams were able to benefit from that and get a lot of sacks and, you know, even some fumbles, stuff like that. It was a lot of that kind of stuff that happened throughout the course of the game. And of course, they struggled to run the football. Hence why they had a Ramir Johnson back there who's, you know, shifty, can make guys miss. But then that was the other problem too. You know, as I touched on earlier, Scott Frost in shortened situations like a 3rd and 2 or a 3rd and 1 would put Ramir in the backfield and have him run up the middle when you had like a Marvin Scott that you could have easily used in that situation. This was a big problem. That was a big problem for Scott Frost. That in the trenches. So I guess I'm touching on both at the same time. Those two were big problems for Scott Frost. On the defensive end, Nebraska struggled to get pressure on the quarterback. Cade McNamara at times had way too much time to throw the football, and it led to some big plays for Michigan. Michigan was able to drive the field quite a bit at times and score way too easy at times. Another issue, playmakers. Nebraska lacked playmakers at the wide receiver position. Guys that could really threaten the second and third level of a defense. Michigan, on the other hand, did not. I already mentioned one of them. One of the main reasons they beat Ohio State twice in a row, Cornelius Johnson. They also had a couple decent tight ends that they used, which Nebraska, as I told you, they had some injuries at the tight end position, so they really couldn't utilize that position as much within this game. I believe Austin Allen was hurt going into that game. And then I forget this other guy's name, Sam Stockhill or Sam Skrill or whatever. His last name is hard to pronounce, but he was one of the top recruits coming out of high school, the top in his class, 6A, player of the year, coming into Michigan, another elite wide receiver. So those two alone were giving Nebraska a lot of problems throughout the course of the game at times. Nebraska didn't have that. Nebraska didn't really have no one within the wide receiving core that can consistently threaten the second and third level of the defense. Their best wide receiver was their running back, Ramir Johnson. This was a big part of why Wendell Robinson was no longer there, who would have greatly helped Nebraska in that game. And I'm going to be honest, they probably would have beat Michigan with Wendell Robinson. Wendell is that much of a difference maker. Another stumbling block for Nebraska, and why Nebraska couldn't quite get over the hump. Special teams. Special teams. I don't remember Nebraska having any plays on special teams. They at least hit all their field goals. I don't think they missed any field goals. But Nebraska's special teams could have helped them in that game. There was no return, no nothing. The special teams was almost, it didn't get in the way, but it didn't really make an impact either. They were just there. And to win a game like that, you got to have your special teams on board. Connor Cope was our kicker, and Connor Cope was solid for that game. I believe he was a transfer from LSU. Had a heck of a 2020 campaign, but for some reason in 2021 could not hit a field goal to save his life. Now I believe he had some injury. He had a lower leg injury that affected his accuracy. But at least in this game, this was one of the better games he had, where at least he didn't get in the way. So at least special teams was okay at best. But you need a little bit more from special teams. You need like a punt return for a touchdown, or a block, something like that could drastically shift momentum. And you really didn't get that out of special teams. That kept Nebraska from breaking through and breaking that seal. And let me go back to the running backs. Nebraska was quite thin at the running back position. Right? Using primarily Ramir Johnson. Michigan had a 1-2 headed monster in Hassan Haskins and Blake Corum, who's still there, who will likely be in Heisman discussions this year and will likely be in the NFL. That 1-2 headed monster was a difference maker, especially in the second half, where Jim Harbaugh decided to say, hey, let's go back to our bread and butter. Let's go back to being Michigan. Let's go back to being physical, ground and pound, downhill. That's what we need to do. That's our identity. That's what we do. When the crowd was cheering and screaming, and it seemed like Nebraska had all the momentum on their side. It seemed like things were shifting to their side, and Nebraska had got the lead. Michigan stayed stable. They stayed constant with their approach, with their identity, which is physical, ground and pound. That along the way opened some plays in the passing game for some of their playmakers, and Michigan was able to stay in the game and survive those punches and throw punches of their own in the second half. This is something that those two areas, Nebraska lacked. Mental toughness. When things go wrong or off the rails, it seemed like Nebraska just falls apart. After that game, Nebraska fell apart. Nebraska didn't win another game. Let me repeat myself. Nebraska didn't win another game after that game. They went 0-6 after that fumble from Adrian Martinez. Mental toughness. The other proponent was an identity. Nebraska lacked a true identity, where when times get tough, let me correct myself. Nebraska lacked a winning identity. Like, when times get tough, they don't know what to go to that can help them win games. Michigan did. With Nebraska, there was really nothing to go to. We can't really threaten nobody with our passing game. So what are we going to do? Run screens all day? We can't really threaten nobody with our run game because our offensive line can't block consistently, so we can't really run the football. Now on top of that, We're thin at the running back position. Could you imagine what a guy like Maurice Washington could have done for that offense? This was another thing. Lack of player development. Scott Frost knew how to recruit and bring talent in, but when he brought them in, he did not properly develop those guys. That's why he lost Wendell Robinson. So you had all these problems that I noticed. If you go back throughout the game, all those problems were there. And they kept Nebraska from winning this game that probably could have changed not just their season, but the course of their entire program and really get it to that next level. You could see it on Frost's eyes. You could see it in Frost's eyes. You could see the look on his face. When they lost that game, he knew it was over. It was over then. Nebraska would go 0-6. Michigan would still lose to Ohio State, but still have a great season. But it did set up for the next few years, where they made the college football playoff and beat Ohio State back to back. So both programs going in two totally different directions. Nebraska now has a new head coach. Michigan has the same coach that many thought would have been gone after in another season or two. It's crazy how one game can turn things around for you. That's what it did for Michigan. Nebraska, on the other hand, it didn't turn things around, but it just went downhill. They were just never able to recover after that. Adrian Martinez, after that year, transferred to Kansas State. And all they did was win the Big 12 championship and win 10 plus games. Now they got destroyed by Alabama, but it is Alabama. Unfortunately, Adrian didn't finish the whole season, but he did get his get back. He did have one of his best games as a football player when they beat Oklahoma on the road. Chris Kleeman really coached Adrian, challenged him to be at his best, and had him prepared because he was coming off of a subpar game the week prior. That was another thing that Frost lacked. You know, the willingness to hold certain players accountable, especially players that he was more in favor of putting on the field. There seemed to be a lack of accountability, which is why players at times seemed comfortable with maybe doing things off the field that they shouldn't have been doing. And I'm not saying nothing scandal like, but as far as like maybe they suffered in the classroom, maybe they didn't take the off season as serious, didn't work as hard, and so they came in and they didn't get better, they didn't progress, and in fact, in some ways, probably regressed. This is kind of what we saw with Maurice Washington. It's kind of what we saw with Adrian Martinez. Chris Kleiman, former North Dakota State coach, a multi-FCS champion, got in Martinez's face and said, hey, you be better. You step up. And was willing to coach Adrian Martinez. He didn't have that at Nebraska. Someone that could push him. One, there was lack of competition. At Kansas State, there actually was legitimate competition. There were a couple quarterbacks behind Adrian Martinez that were just as good, if not better. Particularly in the passing game. But then he had a coach that was willing to push him. And I'm not sure if Frost did all that he needed to do as a head coach. Everybody remembers that controversial fumble at the end of the game, where it's like the whistle should have stopped. Like there was no more forward progress. That should have been blown dead, first down. But if you look at that play, I mean, Martinez was still moving. Guy strips the ball. That was a legitimate fumble, and it was made by Ojabo, one of the top. I think that's the guy's name, but he was one of the top defensive um, tackles, one of the top defensive linemen for Michigan, who was making plays all game long. He was getting sacks and everything. You know, a dynamic defensive lineman, and Nebraska lacked that. They lacked dynamic playmaking ability in the trenches. And it was a big part of why they couldn't get pressure on Cade McNamara. And it was also a big part of why they didn't get off the field on key third downs. And I saw that throughout the course of the game. The other thing is that why is Adrian Martinez trying to play hero ball when all he had to do was go down? You got the first down, go down. You have a minute left. At best, you're going into overtime. Trying to be the hero. Just lack of awareness of, the situation. You only got a minute left. Go down. At best, you're going into OT at home. Game awareness. I wonder how often this coaching staff helped to develop game awareness for a lot of these players. Just being aware of the situation. You have a minute left. At best, you're going to OT. Just go down. Like stuff like that. Has to be coached. So I look back at the coaching staff and wonder, did they do everything they needed to do to prepare this team for those situations? And my answer would have to be obviously no, because we saw throughout the course of the season, final minute, 2 minutes left, how they would squander away opportunities. And we saw this in back-to-back in this Michigan game. This is another thing that held Scott Frost back, and the final point that I'm going to touch on. The clock management at the end of halves, at the end of games. It's why, and if you go back to 2018, the Northwestern game, it's why they lost that game. So when you look at this Nebraska Michigan game, and Michigan won by 3 points, which goes all the way back to what happened earlier in that game where Scott Frost wanted to be aggressive and try to get the first down instead of taking the points. Nebraska lost by 3 points. Had Nebraska set up for that 3, maybe that strip fumble, Michigan kicking the field goal, maybe they don't lose by 3. Maybe it's still a tie game going into OT. So it was these kind of factors that I noticed throughout the course of the game that really defined the type of program that Scott Frost was running. That game told you more than just about that 2021 season. It told you the truth about what was happening with the Nebraska program and really where it stood, really where it really was and where it was headed. We should have knew then that this just ain't it. This is not what currently exists within this program is not what's going to make Nebraska successful for the long run. And that became quite evident as Nebraska would go 1-8 in his next 9 games going into the 2022 season, where Scott Frost was eventually let go. Of course, Mickey Joseph finished off the 2022 season, and now we're here in 2023 with another new head coach in the likes of Matt Rule from the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, we know about his ability to turn teams around. He did it at Temple, did it at Baylor. And now he's here at Nebraska, and we'll see what he can do. I feel good about him. But time will tell. I'm cautiously optimistic. But before we move forward, I just wanted to look back and reflect. What if Nebraska won this game? Obviously, would have did a lot for the program. It probably would have gave them confidence for the rest of the season. Maybe they won some more games. Maybe they make a bowl game. And things are a lot different going into 2022. We are still when they were still trying to go 6-6. So just want to put that in your brain. It was overall it was a solid game, but it was one of those. It was one of the biggest teasers of Scott Frost's tenure. What if we won that game? How different would things be for us? This is your boy Doug Banks. Signing off. 1.